I'd love to hear from you why you're different, because I've learned that your style of watchmaking is completely different to what everyone else does. Hi guys, I'm Adrian and welcome to the third episode of the Bark and Jack podcast. If you're new to Bark and Jack, I just drink coffee, talk about watches, and I kind of document my journey through exploring watches and watch-related things. So if you like that sort of stuff, do hit subscribe. And also, if you like NATO straps, and we do have some premium NATO straps that are built to our specifications, so jump over to barkandjack.shop to check out those NATO straps, and we ship worldwide. Back in October 2018, I went to a clock event at Bonham's Auction House in London, and Roger Smith was there to give a talk. Roger Smith, the renowned watchmaker Roger Smith, who's carrying on the kind of journey and legacy that George Daniels created. The clocks there were absolutely incredible. They kind of showcase the evolution of timekeeping, right from really quite crude sundials and then all the way through to really quite complex clocks that just displayed time in loads of different formats. It's absolutely awesome to see. Anyway, Chris from the Time for a Pint podcast was there, and I know Chris, and he introduced me to Roger Smith because he had already met Roger Smith before. And I'm pretty awkward in social interactions. But luckily with us watch people, we kind of have that go-to topic to talk about, watches. And so naturally I spoke to Roger Smith about watches. Awkwardly, I didn't decide to talk about the Roger Smith watch that was on his wrist. He was actually double wristing that day, and I decided to talk to him about his Rolex Explorer. That was kind of the first awkward thing that I did. And then I showed him that I had a similar watch, a similar Rolex Explorer. He said, "Oh, look, the same watch." And I stupidly corrected him. I mean, they aren't the same watch, because his is the 114270, the slightly newer version, and mine is the previous version, the 14270. I could have stopped there, but for some reason I went even deeper and I started to explain the difference between the 14270 and the 114270. It was completely weird and completely unnecessary. And you know when you hear people say things to try and prove their knowledge, they're kind of dropping facts and little knowledge bombs to try and prove that they know something. But it's completely unnecessary, and these come across as a bit of a dick. Well, that was me. Luckily, regardless, Roger actually ended up inviting me to his workshop on the Isle of Man, and of course I accepted that invitation. And in February this year, 2019, I went over to the Isle of Man and visited Roger Smith. It was my first kind of big Bark and Jack expedition, and it was really great fun to actually go off and do that. He gave me a massive tour of his workshop, kind of demonstrated quite a few processes, went quite deep into the design ideas that he has around watches and the challenges that he comes across when it comes to building a complex watch. And then we sat down and we had a chat. You're going to have to excuse the background noise because we were in a working workshop. And if you want to see, this is just going to be a video of me and him chatting. If you want to see the fully produced videos that I created 3 videos about my trip visiting Roger. I'll put links in the description, but also you can just search YouTube Bark and Jack Roger Smith and they will come up with the videos. Now let's get into the chat with Roger Smith. How do you describe what you do?
Yeah, so well, I suppose it is a difference. And so my approach to watchmaking, well, we call it the Daniels method, and that was an approach which George started, I think, with no real intention in the 1960s, when he had ideas for the advancement of the mechanical timekeeper. He obviously knew how to design watches, but he ended up having to make them himself because there was no industry around to support him. So quite by chance he created this unusual approach where one man will design and make a complete watch from start to finish, and he'll make, to all intents and purposes, every single component within the watch. And this was an idea that just grabbed me, from my very first meeting with George as a 17, 18-year-old, I can't remember when. This idea that one man can sit down and do that, and that's what really sparked it off for me, and that's what we're doing today.
Awesome. And what was that journey for you to? Why did you approach George as a 17, 18-year-old?
Well, actually, he came to the college that I was studying at.
Right. So you'd already started training as a
Yes,
watchmaker.
so I was training as a repairer, restorer. I didn't know what then, and whether it was going to be watches or clocks. And in the second year, George visited the students, and that was my first knowledge of George and the fact that he was a guy making individual handmade watches.
Cool. And so then you approached him, and what did you want to work for him, or did you just want to find out more about him?
So I joined. I went to. I'd already left the college, and I was working for a trade repairs, repairing new watches. And I was just beginning to think that perhaps this wasn't the route I wanted to go down, repairing modern watches. And I always remembered George's visit to the workshops, the college that I was studying at. And in the evening he gave this incredible lecture on his life's work into exploring the his approach to watchmaking and his escapement designs and so on, and the developments of the escapements through to the coaxial escapements. And that just grabbed me, and I was hooked. And so I thought I'd write to George to ask if he'd apprentice me, or give me some advice or anything, any help he could give me to get me into this very tiny, very focused world of watchmaking.
Brilliant. Did you respond straight away?
I think within a few weeks, got a letter back and said that he didn't employ people. But nevertheless, he invited me to the Isle of Mann, and he took me for a tour around his workshops, and basically said, if you want to make watches, you just have to start yourself. Nobody can teach you how to make watches because it's so involved, so complex, especially at his level, that he said, go away and begin making a watch. And that's what I did.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
And now you are in your new workshop.
Here we are. Yeah, many years later.
Many years later.
Yeah.
Although I've started to get a grasp now, having seen your workshop and the extent at which you go working on components that no one other than you and your chaps will see. What is your motivation behind the watches that you make? Well, what are you striving for with your watches? Is it reliability? Is it to make the most complex watch? Is it to make the most beautiful watch? What is it?
I think it's everything. I mean, I think, as I say, I was brought up in this, very unusual approach to watchmaking, where you focus on absolutely every single aspect of a watch. So whether that's the case, the dial, the hands, every single screw, spring, lever, throughout the whole watch, you are 100% focused on that tiny component. And I think it is just this attention to detail. And when I'm designing a watch, as I say, I'm not just designing a nice looking watch, it has to be a very mechanically efficient watch. I've done a lot of work with the coaxial escapement, and we're seeing extraordinary results with that. And it's focusing on the whole watch. It's a complete package as far as I can see, and I think that's the sort of driving force of what I'm trying to do, really.
Awesome. You mentioned coaxial escapement there.
Yes.
I think that's quite. Could you explain in a very simple term how that's different to a normal escapement?
Yes. So the lever escapement is. The big problem with it is that you have a tooth which hits the jewel and is locked there, and then the jewel moves out. The tooth begins to slide down this inclined face, and as it slides down this inclined face, it imparts energy through to the balance wheel, through a lever through to the balance wheel to maintain its oscillation. And it's this sliding action which requires lubrication.
Okay.
So in the lever escapement, this sliding action requires lubrication. As the oil deteriorates, it becomes harder for the tooth to slide down that jewel, and then it slows the watch, and eventually, it may stop the watch because it just gums up. So your watch will go back for a service because this oil has deteriorated, and it'll need removing and refreshing. In the coaxial escapement, the power is delivered by simply a tooth hitting a jewel and just pushing it away. So it's just very much a pushing action. There's minimal sliding there as the tooth slides off the jewel, but because it's in the direction of travel, it's negligible. And although we do use lubrication on our escapements just to, if you like, sort of soften the surfaces, because they can become very dry with modern cleaning processes. So it's due to this pushing action that we the escapement doesn't rely on lubrication, and it's that which is a great advantage to the coaxial. And so you have a longer degree of accuracy before the watch will ever need a service, and it's so that in theory your watch will maintain a high degree of timekeeping for a far longer period than that of the lever escapement.
Brilliant. And that leads nicely on to one of my questions about your specifications.
Oh yes.
So your specifications are a bit more geeky, a bit more detailed than the rest of the watch world. So one of your points, and these I think are repeated on all of your series of watches.
Yes.
Your 4 series plus your open case.
Yes, open dial. Yeah. Yes.
And that's probably because you mentioned earlier you have one caliber.
So basically,
and everything else is built on top.
Yeah, I mean, so each watch is an individual watch in its own right. So the series 5s, the series 1 through to 5, the 5's now the open dial. So we use the same trainer wheels, same barrel trainer wheels, handset mechanism, winding work in each watch, and escapement obviously in each watch, but the base plates are all different.
Right.
So the base plate for the Series 1 is its own individual plate, as is every single other watch in the range. And I don't like these sort of bolt-on complications which I have seen, at times over the years. For me, it's all about creating a completely individual, bespoke watch. And
so my description of it being one caliber with little bits put on top isn't quite right.
Not quite right, no. But as I say, the core timekeeping element components are the same. They're just all in different individual frameworks.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. So some of these questions might be a bit Mickey Mouse, but my understanding and knowledge of the inner workings of a watch are minimal.
Okay.
So you've got one of your specifications is single wheel version of the Daniels coaxial escapements.
Yeah.
So you've taken, I assume, what George Daniels created.
Yes.
And simplified it by single wheel.
Yeah. So basically, so in the very first watches that I started making, the wristwatches, which contain the coaxial. This was back in 2006. I fitted those with the sort of 3-tier sort of system, which is basically a standard pinion, and then you have a lower wheel and an upper wheel, and that comprised the whole escape wheel. And the problem that we were having, I mean, I wasn't aware of this in the early days, but it was basically, it's very difficult to make sure that the teeth of your lower wheel were 100% concentric with the teeth of your upper wheel.
Right.
Because by the time you've made the 2 wheels and then mounted on the arbor, things move, and the coaxial is very accuracy sensitive, has to be bang on. So, and I was noticing that, in practice as well, each watch was slightly different because of this, and we were able it was taking different rates of time to achieve a good rate of timekeeping. There's no consistency, so I was looking at ways of smoothing that out. And then I came upon the idea of creating the single wheel. So basically, we machine the whole wheel in one operation. So that means that we can guarantee that the concentricity of the lower teeth are the same as the upper teeth. But not only that, we can now guarantee that we can fix the angular orientation of the two sets of teeth perfectly to each other. And again, that was a difficulty in the early versions.
Right.
We had to twist the upper wheel round, and that caused difficulties in maintaining the concentricity and angular orientation. So creating that wheel propelled the escapement forward hugely in terms of our ability to achieve a high rate of timekeeping far quicker than we were doing.
Right.
It's still a long process, but nevertheless it's improved it. So I thought, well, this is interesting. We were seeing results straight away. And then from that stage, I started to look at the lightness of the components. And I started to lighten the lever. And again, there were benefits there. And we were seeing the benefits again in speeding up the rating process. But gradually, I think is after I came up with a new design for lightening the single wheel, suddenly we saw a dramatic change in performance.
Right.
And it was at that point that things started to move forward, quite, impressively, I suppose, in terms of the changes to the movements. So again, it speeded up our ability to rate the watches. The actual rate improved, but also more noticeably was the mainspring strength started to drop.
Right.
And that was a real sort of wake up sort of point, really, because up until that point, to me, escapements had always been about timekeeping. That's been the bragging rights of any watchmaker throughout history, is my escapement will keep better time than yours. But actually, for the first time, I began to look at escapements completely differently. And I now, then began to realise that actually, our escapement will keep as good a time as any other escapement out there. Probably better in the long term than all escapements out there. But here we had an escapement which was beginning to benefit the movement.
Right.
So, what I mean by that is that basically it's now taking a weaker and weaker mainspring to achieve the same results. So that meant it was less force going through the pivots, less force going through the winding mechanism. And suddenly I was beginning to realise that, if we can carry on in this same direction, we can actually start to improve on the service intervals of the watches. And surely that's where watchmaking should be going. Because over the last 100 years of making wristwatches, the one thing that has never changed is the service interval. It's still stuck at 3 to 5 years. So I was looking into this, and I thought, well, now that this new design of escape wheel that I created, I thought, well, perhaps this will enable me to shrink the escapement down. Because I began to think that a lighter wheel, a smaller, lighter wheel, will accelerate faster.
Right.
So the tooth will hit its jewel quicker. And hopefully this will, again, be more efficient and enable me to reduce the mainspring strength. But it was always a bit of a known quantity, because although I was hoping that the tooth may hit the jewel quicker and deliver its impulse more smartly, as it were. With a bigger diameter wheel, in effect, what you're getting with a bigger diameter wheel is more delivery of power.
Right. Because
your diameter radius is that much greater. The distance that the impulse is given over is far greater. So it's whether a smaller wheel would actually work, and actually in fact it did. And it just transformed the watch. It really has, as I said, completely changed the way I look at mechanical watches now and their escapements. And we've now reduced the mainspring strength even further. And we have reduced, so we started off with a mainspring strength of I think about 15.5, and now we're down to 11.5, which in terms of watchmaking is, light years apart. That is a staggering improvement in efficiency than mechanical watch.
And the fact that it's a lighter spring, does that mean that the load and the wear on everything is less, therefore ultimately the whole thing's going to last longer?
Yeah, exactly. And service intervals have extended, and now we've increased our service interval to 10 years. But that's based on the old movement. That's based on the Mark 1 movement with the larger diameter escape wheels. That's based on the information that we've compiled over the last 13 years of producing that watch. But in another 10 years, 15 years, once, after this Mark II smaller escape wheel has been out there, I can see us extending that 10 years service interval to maybe 15, maybe 20.
Wow.
Maybe further. I mean, it really is astonishing.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And it's transformed the mechanical watch as far as I'm concerned. it's almost like the automotive industry. I always relate to that. And cars, 30, 40 years ago were unreliable, different animal to what they are now.
Mm-hmm.
And today cars start on the turn of a key and need very little maintenance, very little servicing, and really that's what I'm trying to do with the watch, with the mechanical watch.
That's brilliant.
Mine, I've been brought up in this very focused world of focusing on the mechanism, the watch and its mechanism, and that was all done by George. My experience working with George, and it's always about trying to look for efficiency gains in everything you do in a watch, in all design and so on. And I'm a result of that, really.
Brilliant. So you've kind of two questions, which I think might be related, but might also highlight my inexperience with watches. So all of your watches are rated at 18,000 vibrations an hour.
Yeah.
They're also all manual winds.
Yes.
Is that a connected thing?
So,
because most watches, let's use the ETA movement as a common everyday watch, would beat at around 28.8 thousand vibrations an hour and be automatic.
Yes. So no, there's no correlation between automatic and the rate of the watch. So you could have we could in effect create an 18,000 train watch and have it automatic. So automatic watches came in as mass production really took off in watchmaking, and what they realised was that if you can fit more ticks into a second, then it's far easier to attain a rate of timekeeping far quicker.
Right.
And it meant that you didn't need the highly skilled watchmakers to regulate the watch. You could cut down that sort of area of the whole process. But the way I look at it is, from my approach to watchmaking, is that the fewer ticks you can have per hour, the better.
Right. Because
it means the fewer times your wheels have rotated, your teeth have ticked, your balance has sloshed around in the oil in its settings and so on. So, to me, if you can have 36,000 train, 28,800. To me, an 18,000 train is just a more mechanically efficient way of achieving the same thing. So you see, we have time to spend on regulating our watches and building our watches. So perhaps that's a reason. But I think this sort of 10-year service interval, which we're now doing with our watches, you couldn't do that with a 36,000 train watch or a 28,800. Everything's working too fast, grinding that oil quicker, and as I say, it's all about mechanical efficiency.
I was just going to say it's just another step that you've taken to make this last longer.
Yeah, exactly.
And so how come they are all manual wind? Is that again another more efficient way of the watch running?
No, I think probably because I don't know how to design an automatic yet. I mean,
but you also mentioned something earlier about when I first arrived, around how you want to bring back more of the design of a pocket watch.
Yeah.
And they were all
Manual
wind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So no, I mean, there's nothing nicer than winding a manual watch, says me with an automatic watch on my wrist. But yeah, well, I mean, the design of my watches does go back to seeing early English pocket watches of 200, 300, 400 years ago. And what I began to realise, when I first started building my first couple of pocket watches, trying to show George that I could do this, I was doing some restoration work in the spare time to earn money. And I was working on some nice English pocket watches, and I sort of realised that, you know, you can go to an auction house, spend anywhere from £100 up to a couple of £1,000 and buy a really nice English watch. And with very minimal work, that watch would keep as good as time as it did when it's first made,
right.
200, 300, 400 years ago. And I was thinking, well, why is this? You know, it's the modern mechanical watch, they have a lifespan of 15, 20, 25 years. And they can be worn out at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And I very quickly realised that it's the way that the watches were made. The wristwatch has always been a mass-produced item from its very first infancy. And these handmade pocket watches were very similar to the watch that I was trying to make, to prove to George that I could make a watch. And I thought that this level of watchmaking was missing from the watch industry. And so at the earliest opportunity I had back in 2001, I designed my very first wristwatch, and it's built along these lines of these pocket watches, you know, with very rigid plates, heavier wheels than is the norm. And this led to this sort of idea of creating, you know, a wristwatch which was built to these same exacting standards as these pocket watches, because in theory these wristwatches of mine should be around for hundreds of years and with minimal attention. That's the idea behind it. And I think there's no reason why that shouldn't be achieved.
That's exciting. It's a cool thought to think that
yeah,
in a couple of hundred years someone could be at the auction house picking up one of these.
But if they do need work, it'll be minimal work, because they've been built to be very strong and robust.
Yeah.
And they're all made using traditional materials, nothing crazy about them, no new materials. So it's all replaceable.
That's brilliant. Let's talk about your watch collection.
Yes.
Would you see yourself as a watch collector?
I don't know really.
Are you passionate about watches as a whole, or is it more of a fixation about or determination to make a great watch?
I think that's the main interest, really. Yeah.
Right.
So I mean, I do have some vintage pieces, but I think the main interest of all the watches I do have is basically technical interest.
Okay.
So I have, you know, a few Omegas and so on, and a few Hoyas, but you know, so I have a Hoya which has a caliber 12 in, which for me is just a really interesting movement, and it's a watch that I experienced when I was in my first job after leaving college, and I was just impressed with the design of it and so on, and the uniqueness of it. Very different to any other automatic chrono out there at the time. And then, yes, I think I'm well known for liking Omegas, these early Omegas with the beautiful copper movements, copper-plated movements. And
what is it about the movement that...
It's the design, they're very well designed. You can tell they were designed by watchmakers who cared about the watch and longevity and so on, and they were just really good workhorses. And even today you could buy a 50-year-old, well, even older now, 60-year-old Omega, and with minimal work, you know, similar to the pocket watches, you know, that watch will keep as good a time as when it's first made. And they're just a very robust kind of, I mean, they are mass-produced watches, but kind of that real pre-mass-produced era. I mean, as I say, they were mass-produced, but not like a modern mass-produced watch. And they have a bit more of a leaning in my direction, you know, towards the qualities that a good watch should sort of hold, really. So, yeah, I'm a fan of those. I've got a couple of quartz watches, tuning
Quartz
fork watches. No, I've got an early Mega Quartz, which is
cool, yeah.
fabulous watch.
Yeah.
And again, that was just an interesting phase of the whole watchmaking industry, which nearly killed itself.
Yeah.
But just a wonderful, view as to where people were in those days. And
Part of the history.
Part of the history. Very valuable.
Yeah. And your daily watch?
Yes, Rolex Explorer. So
Rolex
yes,
Explorer.
that's a gift
Snap.
from my wife. Yes, good choice. But just a great watch, knocking around. Doesn't matter if I bash it into a lathe or or a car or anything. So they're just good everyday watches.
Do you have one of your own watches?
I don't. No, I don't. No, I occasionally wear the Great Britain watch,
Right.
which when it's not on loan for the Great Campaign, but. No, I don't. Too busy making everyone else's. So.
How long have you been making them for?
My watches?
Yeah.
Well, I suppose I started 30 years ago.
And you still haven't made yourself your own watch?
No, that's when I started trying to make my first watch, pocket watch, 30 years ago. And still at it.
Wow. That's funny. And there is a story behind this Rolex, isn't there?
This was, if I'm right, the story behind this one?
You had to sell you bought a Rolex.
Oh, sorry.
That you had to sell.
Yeah. So I bought a Rolex when I was a student.
Yeah.
And I was just in love with this watch, and it's a great watch. And I loved it so much that I rarely wore it. And then because I was working at a jeweller's in Manchester, and I was able to buy this watch at staff discount. Is a holy grail of watches for me. And then when I began this venture of, going down this venture of making a watch, I quickly ran out of money. So I had to sell everything I had, including this Rolex. And the biggest regret of my life was never enjoying it.
Right.
Never putting it on my wrist and just enjoying it.
Mm-hmm.
So for my 40th, my wife Caroline bought me this watch, and is a very nice sort of replacement for that hole that was missing in my collection. So
that's very cool.
Yeah, it's lovely. Yeah,
that's brilliant.
Great.
It looks good in you as well.
Yes.
They're great looking watches. One of your chaps has one as well.
Yes, it does. Yes,
early 90s one.
Yeah.
So what is next for you with regards to your watches? Have you got anything in the pipeline?
As always. We've not stopped for 30 years. So it's yes. So we moved into these new workshops in April of last year, and we've got new staff. We've got some more equipment arriving this year. The idea is to try and make a dent in this. We've got a good order book which we need to deliver on, try and improve on delivery dates. But then there are other watches in the pipeline, and there's lots of ideas I want to explore, and each watch that I've designed is just me enjoying exploring what I want to do, really.
Cool.
So there's another few watches up here, and
how complex? Because your Series 4 is really quite complex.
Yeah, it is. That is very complex.
How complex do you think? How complex is it in your head?
So yes, I mean whether the others will be. No, they're not. I mean that was. It's for me. It's not about complexity. It's just about making a particular complication.
Right.
And enjoying the challenge of trying to make it as mechanically efficient as possible. I'm not a great fan of over complicated watches, because as soon as you get lots of complications on a watch, it reduces the service interval. So that's not good.
Yep.
It's not good for the owner in the long term. So that's sort of always something in the back of my mind, but yeah, we'll see. Watch the space, as they say.
Obviously, a massive thanks to Roger Smith for allowing me to invade his workshop, but also to spend so much time with me. It wasn't just a kind of a flying visit. I spent the whole day with him. He actually took me out to lunch. And that was a good thing about this conversation, was the fact that And this was actually the second time that we'd spoken about most of these topics, because we'd spent the whole day together. We sat down and we had a big old lunch together. And so we'd actually spoken about a lot of these things already. So this was actually kind of regurgitated stuff. So good on him for kind of going along with that stuff. If you ever get a chance to meet Roger Smith, or if you ever get a chance to see him talk, do go check him out. He has a wealth of knowledge, and he's so keen on sharing that, and it's quite inspiring to see how much he wants other people to get into watches. He's really keen for the watch community to grow. He's really keen for younger people to get into watches, because essentially it's those people who are going to get fascinated about watches and go off and learn and potentially become the next watchmaker to do whatever. So he's really keen to kind of keep that whole legacy going. And despite his kind of status within the watch world, he's an absolutely lovely chap. Guys, thanks so much for listening to this podcast. Do jump over to the YouTube channel and check out the 3 videos, because he does go into more depth around the design processes and the struggles that he has with certain things, and also talking about the processes of creating the watches. He shares a lot of information. It's really, really fascinating. The whole trip just felt like a massive crash course in watchmaking. Of course, I don't know enough to actually go off and make a watch, but at the end of the trip, I knew so much more than what I did before the trip. And also, every time I go back and edit the content, I seem to pull away kind of more and more knowledge from it all. So it's one of those really deep things that kind of takes a bit of time, and he does get quite geeky, but it's fascinating, and he's kind enough to kind of share that knowledge. Guys, if you do like this podcast, then do hit subscribe, and if you have a chance, please pop over to iTunes and leave a review of any kind. A nice review would be nice, but of any kind, or a review on any podcast thingy that you do. If you want to check out more content, jump over to barkandjack.com. We have articles, we have videos, we have other podcasts on there. And if you want to grab one of those native straps, jump over to barkandjack.shop. Check out those native straps. If you're on Instagram, give us a follow at barkandjack. And thanks again for listening. I'll see you guys next time. Take care. The music track is called Takeaway, and it is by Chameleon Glade.